Welcome to While We Were Distracted, the podcast where we explore topics that often get overshadowed in the rush of daily life. Please take a moment to like and subscribe. It really helps.
When we talk about the Salem Witch Trials of 1692, well, the conversation usually sticks to the local drama, right? The afflicted girls, the village fights, the personalities involved. But today, we want to look much wider than that. We're tracing the philosophical, the legal, the theological roots, really, that were built up over centuries and made this crisis, well, not just possible, but almost necessary in their eyes.
Exactly. Salem wasn't some, isolated hysteria popping up out of nowhere. It was more like the final huge explosion of ideas about invisible spirits that had been deeply embedded in Europe for ages.
Right.
And the legal ways they dealt with them. So our mission today is to unpack that global context, to really understand why the colonists acted the way they did. And we should probably start with how they even defined the crime itself.
Okay, let's do that. Because historically, the term demonology, that was pretty broad, right? Covered basically any supposed interaction with supernatural beings.
Yeah, general concept.
But by the late 17th century, witchcraft, that meant something very specific, very sinister. What was it exactly when those judges sat down in Salem?
It had become, well, basically the worst crime you could imagine. It was defined as a formal, deliberate pact, a compact, with the ultimate enemy, Satan.
A formal compact.
Yes. This wasn't just, local mischief or casting a few spells. This was seen as people actively joining forces with the devil to undermine the gospel, conspire against God, overthrow the church. The key thing, the defining feature, was this alliance with the devil.
Wow. Okay, so to get how they made that leap, we need to go back further. In antiquity, interacting with spirits, that wasn't always seen as evil, was it?
No, not at all. If you look at classical mythology, people actively sought out communication with spirits. They often assumed these beings were trustworthy, or at least sources of valuable knowledge.
So being able to talk to demons using that older, neutral sense of the word could actually be seen as a good thing, like having special insight.
Precisely. Individuals who were thought to be conversant with these spirits were often seen as privileged, possessing, a higher sphere of knowledge. Think about Zoroaster, the philosopher. He got accused of magic just because he knew a lot about astronomy and other sciences.
So if the ancient world often saw it as seeking knowledge, maybe even potentially beneficial, where did the shift happen? When did it turn from curious to criminal?
That's the really key distinction. The Hebrew tradition, the Hebrew polity, was kind of the exception in the ancient world.
How so?
They denounced these kinds of communications as criminal right from the start, put the highest penalties on them. They saw it as fundamentally dangerous to society's well-being. In that sense, they were the radicals back then for criminalizing it.
And we see that political angle playing out in some amazing historical stories too, right? It wasn't just about spiritual power, but actual political influence.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Take the Roman lawgiver, Numa. The stories say he pretended all his political plans came directly from a divinity.
To gain influence.
Exactly. To give his laws more weight, make people accept his rule. He essentially claimed a divine mandate.
And then there's that brilliant story about Furius Chrysinus, the Roman farmer who was, well, maybe a bit too successful.
Yes. His neighbors got jealous, accused him of using magic to steal the fertility of their fields for his own.
And his defense was just fantastic.
It really was. He brings his tools, his strong plows, his spades, and even his sunburnt daughters into the forum. And he says, basically, look, these are my charms. This is my magic. This is the only witchcraft I've used.
He completely reframes it. Sorcery there is just suspicion about hard work and success, not some evil pact.
Exactly. It's about envy of, a natural advantage, not conspiring with the ultimate source of evil.
So when did that shift happen? When does the devil become the absolute central figure, turning simple magic into what you call diabolism?
That really takes hold as the Dark Ages settled over Christendom.
Yeah.
The belief solidified that the devil wasn't just a demon, but the head honcho, the ruler of all demons, and that he could directly interfere in the world, control nature, influence people. So witchcraft then becomes defined only by the alliance, the compact, with this specific evil being who's actively fighting against God.
That makes the difference with figures like the Witch of Endor really stand out then. She used charms, sure, but the story isn't explicitly about her having a deal with Satan.
Precisely. There's ambiguity there. In fact, many scholars, like Sir Walter Scott later on, argued she was probably a fraud, an imposter. And the biblical narrative itself suggests that when the spirit of Samuel actually appeared, it was God intervening directly, and the witch herself was shocked and terrified. It wasn't what she expected.
Right, but by 1692, Salem time, that ambiguity is just gone.
Completely gone.
Yeah.
Legally, theologically, witchcraft meant one thing: a formal, actual compact with the great prince of evil beings, full stop.
And once you have that definition, that compact defined in law, it becomes this universally recognized capital crime. What strikes me is how this wasn't just folk belief. It was endorsed, sanctioned, right from the top government, science, theology, all across Europe.
The whole structure supported it. Think about where the big waves of persecution started. You have Pope Innocent VIII issuing a papal bull in 1484. It wasn't just allowing, it was encouraging the arrest and punishment of suspected witches.
And the results were just horrific.
Staggering. Estimates run into the tens of thousands executed over about 150 years. You see these just unbelievable numbers. 500 burned in Geneva in only 3 months in 1515. One judge in Lorraine, Remigius, condemned 900 people in 15 years.
900 by one judge.
Yes. And it became a political weapon, too.
Yeah.
Joan of Arc was executed on charges of witchcraft and heresy. Luther was accused of being in league with the devil by his opponents.
And even science, or what passed for early science, could get you accused. People like Roger Bacon back in the 13th century.
Right. His work in optics, chemistry, astronomy, things people couldn't understand. So it must be magic, right? He was imprisoned on suspicion of witchcraft. Basically, knowledge itself could be dangerous if it seemed too advanced.
So, turning to the English context that directly fed into Salem, the law changed significantly under King James I, didn't it?
It did. James had written his own book on the subject, Demonology. He was, quite invested in the topic.
An expert in his own mind.
You could say that. And Parliament, likely wanting to curry favor with the new king, passed a much harsher witchcraft statute in 1603.
Harsher how?
Critically, it made witchcraft a capital offense even if the accused hadn't actually caused someone's death. Just the act, the supposed compact itself, was enough to warrant execution and massively widen the net.
And they even messed with the Bible to back him up.
This is a really crucial point. To support the king's specific view on the importance of the compact, his translators deliberately inserted the word familiar, as in familiar spirit, into Deuteronomy 18.11 in the King James Version.
Even though the original Hebrew didn't say that.
Correct. The original Hebrew text doesn't contain a word that directly corresponds to that concept of a familiar spirit assisting a witch. They essentially altered scripture to align with the king's theology and legitimize these stricter laws. Quite something.
Wow. And this wasn't just fringe belief. You had highly respected legal figures endorsing this, like Sir Matthew Hale.
A hugely venerated judge. He presided over a famous trial in 1664, convicted and executed 2 women based on, well, what sounds to us like incredibly flimsy evidence.
Alternative evidence.
Things like a man claimed his horses died after he argued with one of the women. A child supposedly vomited pins in a nail. Evidence like that.
And that trial, it influenced Salem.
Correctly. The published report of Hale's trial became a key legal precedent, an authoritative textbook for the judges sitting in Salem in 1692. The weight of that authority was immense.
Even respected religious figures were involved.
Oh, yes. Richard Baxter, famous for writing The Saint's Everlasting Rest, a widely admired Puritan work. He actually corresponded with Cotton Mather and his father Increase Mather in New England, encouraging them in their efforts against witchcraft.
So these esteemed figures weren't just agreeing with the idea of witchcraft, they were effectively providing the instruction manuals for how to prosecute it.
That's a good way to put it.
Which brings us to the crucial question. What was the evidence according to those manuals? When the Salem judges opened those law books, what methods were actually sanctioned? Because it sounds like proving innocence became almost impossible.
That's really the heart of the tragedy. When the legal framework itself is built on these theological assumptions, how can you defend yourself? The authorized grounds for conviction, often detailed in notorious books like the Malleus Maleficarum, were varied and, frankly, terrifying.
What were some of the, let's say, more physical or tangible forms of evidence they looked for?
Well, you had the famous witch mark. This was supposed to be a spot on the accused body left by the devil's touch that was numb, insensitive to pain. Guards would literally prick the accused with pins to find it.
Pricking with pins. Grim. What else?
Then there was the belief in imps. The idea that witches use small animals, cats, rats, mice, sometimes even spiders or flies, as their demonic helpers, their familiars.
Familiars, right, the word they inserted.
Exactly. And the proof could be absurd. If a guard was watching an accused person and maybe a spider ran across the floor and escaped, well, that could be taken as conclusive proof of guilt. The imp had revealed itself and fled.
Unbelievable. And beyond marks and animals, what about objects? You hear about puppets or dolls being used.
Yes, the use of puppets or poppets. Finding a doll, maybe made of rags, especially if it had pins stuck in it, was seen as direct evidence that the accused was using it for sympathetic magic, tormenting a victim remotely by harming the doll.
Physical proof of malice, essentially.
In their view, yes. But perhaps one of the strangest, most, medieval methods was the trial by tears.
The idea that a witch couldn't cry.
Correct. King James himself pushed this idea. He believed that since witches had rejected the holy water of baptism, water itself rejected them, so they were physically incapable of shedding tears.
So if you were accused, terrified, exhausted, maybe even tortured, and you couldn't cry.
That was taken as proof of your guilt. Failure to weep, no matter the reason, confirmed you were a witch.
But the legal tool that seems most specific to Salem, or at least most devastating there, was spectral evidence.
Oh, absolutely. This was the killer blow to any defense. The doctrine of spectral evidence held that a witch's spirit, their specter or apparition, could leave their physical body and travel any distance to afflict or torment a victim.
So your physical body could be miles away.
Didn't matter. If an accuser claimed your specter attacked them, your alibi was useless. You were charged with committing the assault in spirit form. It completely demolished the possibility of proving you were elsewhere.
Okay, so let's bring this to America. Salem was, as you said, the final explosion, the preeminent instance. But it wasn't the very first time these ideas flared up in the colonies, was it? There were earlier cases, sort of warm-ups.
Definitely. There were trials and even some executions before 1692 in Massachusetts and other parts of New England. Sometimes they fizzled out due to, say, technical errors in the indictment or juries being reluctant to convict. But the precedents were being set.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Margaret Jones in Charlestown back in 1648, she was executed partly because she practiced medicine using simple remedies that actually worked, but were perhaps beyond what the official physicians understood. This success, combined with a supposed malignant touch, was enough.
Success itself was suspicious.
It could be. And then there's the really striking case of Anne Hibbins in Boston, 1656. She was the widow of a prominent man, quite intelligent apparently. She was executed even though the magistrates reportedly opposed it.
Why was she executed then?
A minister at the time basically said she was hanged only for having more wit than her neighbors. Her supposed crime involved correctly guessing that some people talking nearby were actually talking about her.
And that insight
Was taken as proof of supernatural knowledge, therefore evidence of witchcraft. Her intelligence became her downfall.
Then fast forward a bit, closer to Salem, you have the Goodwin children case in Boston, 1688. That one became quite famous.
Yes, involving Cotton Mather directly. The children, particularly one girl, exhibited truly spectacular fits. They'd bark like dogs, gallop like horses, couldn't read the Bible, but weirdly seemed to enjoy the Anglican Book of Common Prayer, which Puritans distrusted.
And this is the case where the child supposedly threw heavy objects at Mather while he was writing.
That's the one. Threw books at his head, but her hand would supposedly stop magically just before hitting him. For Mather, this was absolute proof of demonic activity and also, conveniently, of divine protection for himself.
Okay, so these precedents are building up, but let's connect back to the bigger picture. Why did figures like Mather believe the devil was so active right here in the American wilderness, more so than back in Europe?
There was a prevailing theological theory, supported by respected scholars like Joseph Mead back in England. The idea was that the devil, having been largely defeated in Christian Europe,
Or so they thought.
right, had basically retreated to the American wilderness. This was seen as his last stronghold, his final territory on earth. And crucially, they believed he had allied himself with the Native American inhabitants.
So the colonists saw themselves as being on the front lines of a cosmic battle.
Exactly. They viewed themselves as champions of the cross, literally tasked with driving Satan out of his last refuge. The Salem trials, in this context, became something much bigger than punishing local troublemakers. It was seen as a desperate, final battle for the soul of the continent itself. They believed they were fighting the devil face to face.
That context, it really does explain the sheer intensity of 1692, doesn't it? The Salem crisis wasn't unique because the beliefs were new. We've seen those were centuries old, backed by the highest authorities in Europe.
Popes, kings, esteemed judges, theologians.
Right. What made Salem stand out was just the sheer ferocity with which this specific community, a very determined, intellectually vigorous group of people, applied those established doctrines. They took the existing law and theology and followed it through fearlessly to its natural and legitimate results, as one historian put it.
And what's really striking, maybe the ultimate irony, is that the very culmination of these beliefs in such a concentrated, horrifying spectacle, the sheer absurdity and awful human cost of the proceedings, that's what ultimately killed the widespread belief.
Not just rational arguments against it.
Rational critics like Wierus or Becker had existed before, but they hadn't stopped the persecutions. It seems it was the stark reality, the undeniable evidence of terrible injustice played out so publicly in Salem, the sheer logic of events, that finally started to root out the witchcraft superstition from the minds of educated people, at least on that scale. The horror itself became the antidote.
So, what does this all mean for us looking back? It's truly sobering to think that the legal authority of someone like Sir Matthew Hale or the philosophical weight of Sir Thomas Browne, who also affirmed belief in witchcraft, could contribute to such awful miscarriages of justice. People genuinely believing they were doing God's work while relying on spectral spiders and whether someone could cry on command.
It really forces you to ask a difficult question. Our ancestors, the people who conducted these trials, were operating under sharply defined, absolute ideas sanctioned by the highest levels of learning, law, and piety of their time. They weren't acting randomly. They were following the established truth.
So the question for you listening now is this. What universally accepted convictions, laws, scientific certainties, or deeply held beliefs govern our society today? Which of our absolute truths might future generations look back on with the same sense of shock and bewilderment that we feel when we look back at Salem? It's worth thinking about how knowledge, especially when held absolutely, gets applied.
Don't forget to like and subscribe for the next episode on While We Were Distracted.